Jazz Loft.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We are very full of energy this morning, clearly. The sessions so far have been waking up and stimulating everyone. Lots of conversations going on. We're about to get this next session started. And I sometimes think a good way to let everyone nearby know that the session is about to start is to give a huge round of applause as a signal that we're going. All right, thanks very much, everyone. So another amazing fiction session that's about to start with two extraordinary novelists. I'm going to hand over in a second to the host of the event, who will take over, introduce them, let them know what's going on. But I just wanted to say, on behalf of the festival, first, we're so glad to finally have Lauren Francis-Sharma here. A writer who we've wanted to bring home to Trinidad for a long time. COVID got in the way. Her last book came out at a time when no one could move around, but we got her here in the end. So Lauren, thank you so much for coming. I'm also very happy to have Michael Magee here. Please give him a big welcome as well. As you will have heard and probably seen, yesterday in various conversations in the program, we have a delegation from Belfast visiting the festival this year. Thanks to the support of the British Council. They're here to basically kind of figure out, like, what does Belfast have in common with Port of Spain? What does our writing have in common? This session is going to be a particularly interesting one because in some ways, their books are extremely different, but in some ways not that different. And I think that will come out in the conversation. And hopefully, by the end of it, you'll figure out why we thought this made such a, on the face of it, unusual, but actually very interesting pairing of novels. So I'm going to hand you over now to Teresa White, who's the host for the session. Teresa, in a book context, you probably all know her best for the pieces that she's been writing in the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian, book reviews, commentary on books. We're very happy to have her here running this conversation with the writers this morning. Let's give them a round of applause again and get it started.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. It's like hugely big for me to be sitting here amongst writers. The Stendhal syndrome kicked in sometime around Thursday, and it's been going strong. So I'm going to try and be sort of not too tickerish and mature and sensible in my posing of questions. Arrived here, it's month end. We're in downtown Port of Spain, and it's Saturday, and it's really quiet outside. And that's because of the state of Trinidad. That's because of the violence and the crime we have in Trinidad. It's unheard of. But I come in here, and there's this huge, amazing, positive vibe. And this is like a light. It's a beacon, which sounds surprising on a beautiful sunny day like today, but it's really huge for the kind of transformation we need as a people. And that starts in our literary imagination and the tales that we tell and the narratives that we get out there. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that, and my deep honor to be talking to these two great writers whose books I would not have known about had I not been asked to sit on this panel, and I'm just so pleased because I've been pretty blown away. Lauren Francis-Sharma, she has Trini roots, as we've learnt, and her first novel, Till the Well Runs Dry, won the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Now, that's about blanchisseuse, I understand, and that's where I spend my weekends. I had to say last night to my iPhone, sorry, I don't need how long it's going to take me to get to the North Coast Road, because I'm not going there this weekend. She's the Book of the Little Acts, which we'll talk a little bit about, won the Libraries Transformed Book Prize, and we know how controversial libraries are getting in the world and in the US particularly. It was also the Hurston Wright Award for fiction finals, and she was a judge on the fiction panel of this year's Bookers, and we have the pleasure of knowing how amazing the outcome of that vote was. Michael is from the north of Ireland. I've learned that. And he's British Council sponsored, so shout out to the British High Commission. And interesting, because we perhaps might touch on some sort of colonial and imperial themes later on, but okay. Close to Home is his debut novel. It's been getting really good reviews. If you have a chance, read the one from a few days ago in the UK Guardian. And he's the fiction editor of The Tangerine. So good stuff here. At first I thought, yeah, these books are vastly different, but there was actually a lot to unpack then, and we learn quite quickly that there are some similar themes. So no more from me, and over to Michael. You want to do the first reading?
Yep,
Thanks.
that sounds good. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm just going to read the first 4 or 5 pages. Let me just get my bearings here, and then we'll go from there. Part 1. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion. There was nothing to it. I swung and hit him, and he dropped. A girl came flying forward and pushed me. What did you do that for? The lad was lying there, and I was standing over him, and there were people all around me making noise. By the time I got away from the tussle, 2 Land Rovers had pulled up. A jaded-looking peeler with a receding hairline came towards me. Is that blood? He said, pointing to a stain on my shirt that could have been anything. He took my name and number and told me he would be in touch. I held my hands up and said that was no problem. He came at me, I said. I didn't know what to do. At the top of the street, the lad was put on a stretcher, and the stretcher was heaved into the back of an ambulance. I think it's best you make your way home, the peeler said. I decided he was a good peeler, a helpful peeler. We'll be in touch, he said, and I thanked him. Thanks very much, I said. Back at the flat, Ryan had his phone in his face and was pacing up and down the living room, looking for a party. But it was 5 o'clock in the morning and the birds were out. He pulled the blinds closed as if that would help and nearly took the window with him, the brightness. I grabbed the purple throw my ma had given us as a moving in present and pulled it over my head. I lay with my head on the pillow and stared through the space between the empty bottles. Ryan checked the fridge, the cupboard next to the fridge. He lifted a can from the counter and gave it a shake. I give up, I said. Give up? You haven't done fuck all. I'm going to bed. For fuck's sake, Sean, don't leave me hanging here. I'm not leaving you anywhere, I'm in the next room. Bounce into my bed, sure. We'll watch a film. We need to stop doing this. Doing what? Come on. The window above the bed was open and the breeze wafted through. I stripped down to my boxers and climbed under the covers, but stayed on the outside so I could creep into my own bed as soon as Ryan passed out. The wall was black with mold, and it made the room smell damp. There were clothes all over the place, takeaway cartons, cups and glasses and empty cans. Ryan smoked too much weed, that's what it was. It made him lazy. It made him not give up Alex. I said to him, you smoke too much of that shit, and took the spliff off him. He didn't care. He was sinking into it nicely, and he had his favourite film on, The Shawshank Redemption. He made me watch it every time we ended up like this. It gave him hope. Watch this, he said. It was that scene he loved, the one where Andy Dufresne arrives at the penitentiary and all the inmates are going mad, screaming at him, calling him and the rest of the newcomers fresh fish. I didn't think much of Andy the first time I laid eyes on him. That was Rand's favourite line. He thought it was brilliant. I did too. Never judge a book by its cover, that's what that means. Never judge anybody, because you never know. The next morning, or later that morning, whatever way you want to put it, somebody was at the door. I rolled onto my side and tried to go back to sleep, but Rand was up. He was shaking me, and he was like, "That doesn't sound good." I sat up on the edge of the bed. It was better to do these things in stages, and watched Rand lean with his ear against the door. "Sounds like there's a few of them," he said. "Men?" "Aye, men." I looked out the window and saw a car parked up at the front of the block. The driver's side door was open. I heard a radio, not the kind that played music, the other one. "It's not the Peelers," Rand said. "How do you know?" "Because they would have shouted. They always shout." The knocking stopped. Footsteps echoed out the hall and were gone. The living room was a state. There were fag butts everywhere, spilled drink. Some dirty bastard had been flicking ice in the bottle caps, and the bottle caps had fallen on the floor. I brushed and mopped and got rid of the empties. Then I sat for a minute and looked out the window. We had a good view. The flat was on the 4th floor, so we could see right over the rooftops the Casement Park and the mountain. You can't miss the mountain. It's everywhere you go, every street and road in West Belfast. You can't get away from it. Whoever's writing those messages up there knows fine rightly as well. They couldn't have picked a better spot. Today, it was a massive tricolour, and underneath it they had written the words, "End Internment." "Who do you think it was?" Rand said. "Dunno. Dissidents." "Why would dissidents be calling here?" "I thought you meant the mountain." Rand looked out the window. "That's not dissidents, you rocket." "Who is it then?" "Fuck knows, could be anyone," he said. Then he clapped his hands. "It's the Illuminati. The Illuminati have infiltrated the IRA." He opened the fridge and stared at the empty shelves. The acne on his back was getting worse. The pimples had gone purple and bubbled under the skin. 6 months in the gym will do that. And the steroids he'd made me inject into his arse cheek every other day. You could see it in his face, the puffiness, the jacked up redness around his neck and shoulders. "We need food," he said. "Have you cash?" "Nah, spunked everything last night." "Me too." I boiled the kettle and brought it with me into the bathroom, filled the sink with hot water and topped it up with cold. The boiler was broke. There was no heat in the radiators, no hot water, and it wasn't like we could phone the landlord and ask him to sort it out. He went bankrupt and did a runner to Spain, leaving a load of properties to be repossessed. That's why we didn't answer the door that morning. It could have been someone looking to turf us out. I started on my hair, giving it a good go with shampoo. I used a cup to rinse the suds and got to splashing my balls and torso. Then I sat on the edge of the bath and looked at my hand. The knuckles weren't swollen and my fingers were all intact. I made a fist and stared at it, then at my arm right up to the shoulder, where the thin lines of my tribal tattoo were so black they looked blue. I need to get out of this, I thought. I didn't know what this was. Cheers.
So, Lauren, would you like to give us a reading as well? And then we can have a little chat.
First, I just want to say how happy I am to be here. Finally, in focus. So, thank you. I'll set this up a little. The English have overthrown the Spanish in Trinidad, and the Rendon family is a land-owning black family, and they're beginning to see how different English rule will be for them. Rosa is their youngest child, and she is the heroine of this story. Life in Trinidad is just beginning to unravel for her. So it's 1803. What Rosa would learn much too late, and what Papa did not say, was that his meeting with Senor Cardoza had been far less than pleasurable. Cardoza had invited Papa to ride out with him to inspect the swath of land that his father-in-law, still in Spain, promised to purchase for Cardoza if Cardoza put an end to his relationship with the Obeah woman. Senor Cardoza told Papa that that would not be so easy, and yet he was in excellent spirits that day. Papa had heard that after Cardoza pledged his oath of allegiance to the crown, he turned over to the authorities 2 Spaniards for publicly expressing discomfort with English rule. The 2 men who had once been his friends were expelled from the island within days and shipped to Venezuela, and the English demonstrated their earnest appreciation by allowing Cardoza first rights to purchase the men's land. Cardoza promptly bought and sold such parcels for a handsome profit. It seems tables have turned quite suddenly on this strange island we inhabit here, he said. Then Senor Cardoza told Papa that the English had found a new way to thwart the abolitionists. They are now bringing slaves under the guise of domestic service, as if one man needs 50 house servants. They bring them in scores, one to sweep, another to clip nose hairs, 2 footmen for each child, and when the Englishmen don't have offspring, they write on the papers that a servant must attend to each hunting dog. They must think they're Bayesians. Cardoza went on to say that once the English extinguished this current path with the Africans, which had already roused the abolitionists to the brink of war, they planned next to import servants from the East Indies, Hindustans, he said. They'll tell the Hindustans that here in Trinidad their caste will mean nothing, that after a few years of light labor they will have land and even a new name if they desire, and this, the landowners hope, will quiet the abolitionists and open all the free labor any Englishman could want for years, since of course there'll be no written agreement with the Hindustan illiterates. Cardoza then told Papa that what he would say next was not a prediction, but a fact. The English have been here for 6 years. They're readying themselves, looking for well-placed, well-established land to set up plantations for sugar. Your property, Damas, is on a very short and distinguished list. Papa would return home and tell Mama that he no longer knew what to believe, no longer knew whom to trust in this new life of theirs. A few days later, Rosa had not wished to be found. She was in the stables wearing Jeremiah's old trousers, preparing her horse, for she had planned not to return home until evening. The young man they expected that afternoon was Madame Bernadette's nephew, and Rosa had no interest in meeting him. He's arriving at 2, and still you're not dressed? In the preceding weeks, there had been a flurry of communication between Madame Bernadette and Rosa's parents. Madame Bernadette, he had told Mama and Papa that her nephew would have been far more keen if he were coming to meet her sister Eve, but said Rosa will do for now. In anticipation of the meeting, the nephew had asked a school teacher from his village to write on his behalf 2 letters of introduction, one to Damas and the other to Rosa, telling of his interests, fishing, carpentry, farming, and wishing to hear more of hers. Rosa never read the letter. Chupisness, she called it. So Mama and Eve responded in her stead. They wrote of Rosa's industriousness, of her brilliance with the horses, of her desire always to learn. Nothing of her beauty. She'd overheard Papa asking Mama. It's best if we do not build her up too much, Mama had said. I know Bernadette has given the boy an earful. He needs a wife who can work hard. That's what Rosa can offer him. But she's pretty, you know this, yes? Rosa knew Mama did not see her in this way. As she listened to her parents, she could not recall a moment when her mother regarded her face as though to admire it rather than to critique it. Damas, I know how the world sees Rosa. It will do her no good to be told she is lovely here and to be shocked when people do not respond to her in the same way they respond to girls like Eve. Not being prepared for the cruelty of the world can crush a child. Had crushed a child. Madame Bernadette said he's a prompt young man. Papa was pretending now not to take note of Rosa's displeasure. This was what he would do until just after lunchtime, when Rosa would make it so he could not do that any longer. Your mama will die of embarrassment if you don't put on a proper dress. Papa's trousers were pressed, and the vest he wore was fashioned out of something familiar. Your mother's expecting you to help with lunch. No man will wish to marry you if you can't prove you're a good cook. Rosa remembered her brother Jeremiah saying once that he believed he was born in the wrong era, too late along the spectrum of human development to take pleasure in the things he loved the most. But as Rosa reflected upon his words, she could not imagine an era when she would not have suffered the same fate, or worse. She sometimes felt she'd been born not at the wrong time so much as in the wrong body or with the wrong mind for her body. Listen to yourself. I have only 16 years. I have no interest in this. Rosa unlaced the saddle and Papa removed it from the horse. And what about your mother? Papa said. Rosa knew what Papa was doing. Mama had been fighting some or another ailment for nearly every day since the English arrived. She was not a frail woman, but she seemed to carry the collective weight of the family strain. She had been Papa's consoler and strategist, had been persistent in her assurances to Eve that they would marry her well, and had gone as far as to issue a call to all the gentlewomen she knew on Eve's behalf. She worried always about Jeremiah's, how he would make do with so little, all while watching the country to which she'd chosen to emigrate become less and less worthy of the risks she'd taken. The strain of living in Trinidad, Mama had said, was sometimes too much to bear. The English were growing more fearful of being outnumbered by the same Africans they were illegally importing, and the continual enforcement of arcane Spanish laws bordered on the absurd. And so the thought of Rosa marrying, the thought of her proper wedding to plan, of more grandchildren, had not only lifted Mama's spirits, but had also lifted the veil that had befallen their home. Was Rosa willing to undo that sweet bit of goodness? Things change, Rosa, and I know this is hard for you to understand, but your brother is right. We could lose everything. It's not fair, but this is the way it is until it's not. Go on inside and get ready, he told Rosa. The young man arrived promptly with his uncle, Madame Bernadette's eldest brother. The uncle was a hunched man with eyes milky like pearls. He called out before opening the gate, "Rendon, we come, we come." Papa met them at the palms while Rosa watched from the window, the insides of her belly swimming. Papa seemed certain that once he married off Rosa to the boy and deeded the land to him, that Monsieur Benoit, who had been allying himself well with the land-holding Englishman, would pay off anyone who attempted to take the land from his son, even if he was a bastard. It was an arrangement Papa believed would please everyone except, of course, Rosa. As Papa escorted the two men inside, Rosa heard the uncle mention the particular sidelong glances he'd been receiving from the newly arrived Englishman and the additional questioning by the constables. Papa told him that after they got through talking about Rosa and the boy, they'd discuss all this Englishman's ways. Then Papa brought the men to stand before the table, which was well appointed with a white lace cloth and a red bougainvillea. Eve had set the table for 5 before leaving. Most Sundays she attended noon mass, but with the church under repair, she was instead sent to lunch with a friend, for it was presumed that she would have been a great distraction. Before she departed, however, Eve fixed Rosa's hair and told her that she was to add water, salt, and a dash of pepper sauce and drop the fish into the pot at precisely the right time to avoid its overcooking. And oh yes, of course, Eve told Rosa that she should be required to smile. "Take the apron away from your clothes," Mama whispered, putting down the flyaway strands of Rosa's hair. Rosa shoved the apron beneath the table as Mama took the old man's hand, greeting him as if they were long ago friends. "Lamech," her mother said, introducing him to her. Lamech bowed, his eyes surveying Rosa's as if to seek her approval. Rosa was surprised by this, surprised he had not grimaced or sneered. She suspected that the allure of the land and the sweet neighs of the ponies in the stable made him look kindlier upon her. "Pleasure," she said, curtsying as Mama had required her to do. He had soft-looking hands, not exactly farmer's hands, and thread-thin lips and smelled of Bastille soap. He was not an ugly boy, though he looked nothing as Rosa expected. His aunt was a heavy-set woman with red-tinted face bookended by dimples. He, on the other hand, was wiry, his complexion like tea with half milk, and one could not be certain when taking in his features If indeed his father was a full Frenchman, for Lamech had a strong nose, a nose Rosa would now know would not be good enough for her sister Eve. Sit, sit, Mama showed Lamech to his seat, Rosa's seat, and offered him a cup of ginger beer and a few slices of ripe mango, while Rosa went to the back of the house to tend to the soup. Rosa hated fish broth. No one had asked what she wanted for lunch. If they had, fish broth wouldn't have been it. She hated the 2 large potatoes, how long it took the carrots to cool. She hated green figs and the fish eyes that every rendon sucked with fervor. She hated hot soup served on the muggiest day of the year, and hated that this boy man Lamech was in her house, in her chair, making ready to eat soup he believed she cooked for him. Lamech, she said, mocking her mother's accent. Rosa opened 2 full jars of Mama's homemade pepper sauce, a spoonful of which would make grown men wager on who would perspire most, and poured the contents of both jars into the pot, hitting the containers on their bottoms to be certain it was all added. As she brought in the bowls atop a large wooden tray, Rosa overheard her father preparing their guests for a most spectacular meal. Lamech rose to help her. Mama looked on, impressed at the young man's act of benevolence. Rosa could only think what a bore he would be when he overtook their land and took up permanent residence in her chair, pining to sniff Eve's undergarments and bossing Mama as though he actually owned the blasted place. Rosa doled out the broth, placing spoons next to each bowl, and poured more ginger beer for Lamech and his toothless uncle. No wonder Madame Bernadette told them to prepare soup. Rosa took Eve's seat across from Lamech, and he watched her as she sat, watched her as she sipped from her cup, watched her as she listened to Papa, who would not stop speaking of the tour of the property they would take after lunch, of how critical Rosa had been to the maintenance of the land, how much Rosa knew of horses. And Rosa was certain Papa would have continued, except for Mama reminded him that the soup before them was growing cold. Rosa sipped from the cup again and glanced at Lamech over its rim. He sniffed the contents of the bowl, his eyes narrowing before taking up in his spoon. But it was Lamech's pearly-eyed uncle who slurped first. The old man began to speak, but his words were cut by a cough, a violent cough. Mama, Papa, and Lamech reached for the cups of ginger beer that offered little relief. Mama cusped her throat with one hand and patted the old man's back with the other, but it was Papa and Lamech who jumped to their feet when the old man began to clutch his chest. Rosa ran for water. His hands trembled as she searched for the pail. What has she done? Lamech knelt before his uncle, urging him to drink up, telling him all would be well. The young man's eyes rained tears. He seemed to be a kind boy, who Rosa now believed had only wanted to please his family by coming to the house to meet her. It took nearly a half hour before the old man was well enough to stand. Papa steadied him at the elbow as they walked toward the wagon, and Mama whispered a most heartfelt apology with her hand to her bosom, swearing that nothing like this would ever happen again. Lamech steadied his uncle on the seat before dismounting to face Rosa. "I'm sorry this was not what you hoped it would be," he said. Rosa did not meet his eye. "But you could have said so. You could have just said so," he said. Rosa was certain they both knew this to be untrue. But to say that a girl's words mattered was far easier than to examine why they did not.
Far easier to say why they did not. You know, these very sort of entrenched gendered expectations. When you listen to that passage, you hear all the sense. There's a strong sense of encumbrance on both the men and the women, both the males and the females, but particularly so on Rosa in terms also of notions of beauty. So you have that sort of race intersection as well. How did you see Rosa in terms of reacting to these gendered expectations and her resistance towards them?
Yeah. That plays a very large role in the arc of the book, is Rosa's resistance. In the end, she ends up leaving Trinidad, and a lot of that is about her unwillingness to play second in her home. She's a strong girl. She's a farmer. She's wonderful with the horses, and yet they're trying to marry her off. They're trying to marry her off so they can actually maintain their land in this very new and more oppressive system once the Spanish have come. You know, one of the interesting things about the history of Trinidad is the Spanish were here, but they weren't interested. Once they didn't find gold, they were sort of like, we have this property, so, but when the English came, they did different things. They ruled like the way the English ruled everywhere else. And so it was a very new experience for the people living on the island. And Rosa is feeling the effects, not only in her home, the personal effects, but the global effects. It's actually having a real impact on this family. And so her resistance is not just a resistance to not wanting to get married, but a resistance to everything that's occurring in this only home that she's known.
I mean, women get the short end of the stick, but that is a simple way of looking at things. Even when there are categories or people in certain status groups who are more powerful generally or deemed to have more power, there's still obligations imposed upon them, things that they've got to live up to. Michael, the acne that's rotting, the injections at the backside, of steroids, that need to be hard. Looking at the fist. Tell us about that.
I mean, yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with why this punch happens, at the start of the book, is that there's a certain degree of expectations on the kind of man Sean has to be, and he's conflicted in and of himself because his background is that he comes from a sort of working class background in West Belfast, and so that environment is quite a violent place. It's sort of post-conflict sort of areas that have been marked and scarred terribly in all sorts of ways. And so he's sort of carrying that in him. He left and has gone to university and seemingly did everything right. Got his degree and was a good boy. And then he, upon returning to Belfast, sort of falls back into old routines. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he returns to a city that offers very little in the way of opportunities for people. It's sort of set in around 2012, which is just after the economic crash. So when he returns, there's nothing for him or for any of the boys that he grew up with. And they all sort of find various outlets for that, for trying to navigate that, suddenly unemployed, suddenly poor, suddenly angry. And I think so much of the body of lads building themselves up to be strong, to fight, has a lot to do with that. And also just in terms of the culture that they were sort of born into, that they... And Sean, with him, he's kind of stuck in that, like, he doesn't want this, and then this punch happens, which kicks off this sort of chain of events. And it's kind of against his character in a way, there's parts of the book that sort of dip into his past and how afraid he actually was of violence and how violence actually scars him. And he's reluctant, in some way to engage in it. And yet he did this. And he doesn't understand why. And it's sort of, as the book goes on, you sort of have an idea who Sean is at the start and who his mates are. And as the book goes on, then you sort of understand why they are the way they are, but also it sort of subverts the reader's expectations of who they are. And it's never as simple as just violence, Violence doesn't happen. It's not a natural thing, I don't think, for anybody. It's to do with the conditions of people's lives. And if those conditions are sort of intolerable or difficult, which is why crime happens, Crime happens because of poverty and because of economic hardship and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's the milieu that Sean comes from, But he's kind of stuck,
So that notion of anger, Lauren, when we talked earlier this week, you spoke of the repetitive experiences of, the experience of British colonialism, and the fact that wherever you go, there are great similarities in terms of the abjection and dehumanizing effect, and how that makes people feel, the anger that they retain. Rosa's anger, how is that directed?
I think that her anger is much more sort of inward. There's a lot of she's a strong girl, but there's an incredible amount of self-doubt. This sense that she's very unsure of her place in the world. I mean, when we were speaking, one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to draw these parallelisms between sort of what was happening in the Caribbean at the time and what would then happen in North America, within sort of a 50-year difference, right? And so what's taking place in the Caribbean with colonialism and the removal of indigenous people and bringing in indentured servants, later on, all of that would happen in the States, just in North America, I should say, within like 50 years. So Rosa thinks she's moving away from something. She feels like she's moving towards something, some other possibility, and it just follows her. And one of the fascinating things about these very large systems of racism, classism, all of this, colonialism, is that none of us can escape it. Like we can't escape it, and we're always being touched by it in some way, and we're implicated by it, whether we want to be or not. Her father is a landowner, but he himself gets very caught up in this system. Trying to have something, but also realizing that he can't keep his hands clean if he needs to feed his family, if he needs to provide for them the way that he feels a man should be able to provide for his family. And they're all caught up in the system. So even when Rosa ends up in North America, she finds herself running away and not being able to live the life that she wants. So her relationship with her son becomes so fraught because of that. And that happens, right? Yes, it's sort of what you were just saying, Michael, like this system where you begin to turn on yourself, you begin to turn on the people who are closest to you and who love you the most, and it's almost inescapable.
Yeah, not escaping to anywhere safe. And again, gendered expectations, fatherhood. Rosa's father is trying to keep his family safe. He adores Rosa, and he does, and he sees her beauty, but he is making these choices, and there are other choices he makes that I'm not going to, because if you read the book and you know that ahead, I think it will spoil the unraveling, but it is complicated, needless to say. And fatherhood in close to home, there's some things there as well. On the one hand, the father that protects, and then on the other hand, the father that doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think a lot of things I was thinking about when I was writing it was like Sean's relationships with the people around him, as well as the sort of political and social context in which he's like operating in which he lives, And so there's various structures that sort of shape his life, whether it's his class, his educational background, his family background. He grows up, his mother is his single mother with two brothers, so she was kind of the only figure in his life. His father, he's estranged from for reasons that are revealed in the book and are quite dark. His father was abusive and hasn't been in his life since he was a young boy. And he's kind of haunted both by the fact that his father isn't there anymore, and also by the fact that there was this conflict, that happened, that his mother lived through very directly, and that happened kind of on his mother's doorstep, It's the thing about the Troubles. I mean, this is all we talk about, really, isn't it? It's like, the thing about the Troubles. But the thing about the Troubles is that, it was a very concentrated conflict in that it happened in areas of poverty. That's where the violence, the vast majority, were disproportionately affected people from poor backgrounds. And that sort of manifested itself in all sorts of ways, whether it was sectarian violence or state violence, British state violence in particular, And so the absence of his father, his presence of his mother, but his mother who had lived through this kind of terrible conflict that she witnessed and saw and was implicated in all sorts of ways, and then him kind of inheriting the trauma from that. And you know, because his that's one of the things that is being spoken about a lot now in terms of the North, is that there is this huge generation of young people whose parents live very directly through it. Something like half of the population of Northern Ireland, as some would call it, suffer from some form of PTSD, undiagnosed. And so there's this massive mental health crisis. And there's also this generation of young people who have carried that, and that sort of manifests itself in like a drugs epidemic, you know, a suicide epidemic. We have one of the highest suicide rates in Western Europe. You know, and the big staggering statistic is that more people have committed suicide in the north of Ireland since the peace agreement in 1998 than died during the entire 30-year conflict. And so that's like a massive indicator, and that's Sean's generation. And so his friends and everyone around them, you know, were all kind of marked, but they don't quite know how. And so a lot of the process of writing the book was kind of understanding this kind of sociological context, and then thinking, but they can't really grasp this themselves, you know. Everything's through their actions, whether it's like getting into fights or breaking down or taking loads of drugs, you know, and getting to that point where they actually open up to themselves in some way. And how all these things kind of shape the individual and the character within a sort of broader context, you know. That's kind of...
Yeah. So Ireland was not officially a British colony, but the English certainly had a very deep hand in...
I'll actually...
You say it was officially a colony? Yeah.
Well, the English presence in Ireland can trace back to like the 12th century.
Yeah.
Ireland is known as the English laboratory, and the place in which they perfected their methods of colonialism, which were applied across the empire, you know. And so, you know, in the same way that they did everywhere else, they came to civilize the barbarian, essentially, you know, and that came with an erasure of language, of culture, of land. Something like 95% of Irish land was dispossessed.
And as you well know, in the U.S., right, a lot of Irish people were indentured servants. You know, next to slaves, they're bringing in Irish folks as indentured servants.
And they came here to the Caribbean as well.
And they came here to the Caribbean.
So there's, I only recently found out about the Red Legs in Barbados, which is an incredible, so there is these connections, you know, and it feels in the Irish imagination, colonialism feels distant, but yet you can't speak about the Troubles or the last 100 years of history in the North without actually looking at it through that lens, because that was an outgrowth of colonial oppression and conflict, you know.
So I'm getting the time signals. It's there was a question I wanted to ask, which I will not have time, but I just want to set it in people's minds around the transience of people moving away and what they're finding, which of course is what happens when things aren't very nice at home. But perhaps some questions from the audience.
That went really fast. It's like,
I'm Lauren's biggest fan.
I love her.
So I had a question for you, because also I'm not familiar with your work, but I can't wait to read your book. I was thinking about just like the subversion of like male expectations, especially with Rosa's son, who also fails to meet the standard of manhood. And they go, like Rosa and her son go on this giant journey. It's a hero's journey. It's fascinating what happens along the way. And I'm just really curious to hear you, Lauren, talk about like the ways in which you wanted to create this new sense of masculinity. And then like what it is that I'm thinking a lot about the conversation that we just heard before. And thinking about like, what do you think is the role of men in redefining masculinity?
Thank you, Clavis, I think.
I'll let you answer that one.
Well, you know, Rosa's father is he's my favorite character in this book. And and at some point they have this conflict, you know, where he talks about sort of the heaviness of being a man and how burdensome it feels. And he's saying to her, you have no clue what I'm carrying, you know? But he's also someone who recognizes her and sees her and is gentle with her. So in this journey that you mentioned that she takes with her son, she's seeing her father in her son, and she wants as much as she can to shape him with the love and the compassion and the integrity that her father has given to her and that he exemplified as much as he possibly could within this very strange system. But what was interesting for me is that I had a completely different arc for that son in this book. You know, the book deals with not just Trinidad, but also Native Americans, indigenous people in North America. So particularly the Crow tribe, which is in Montana. And so I had a lot of conversations with people from the Crow tribe, you know, trying to understand what masculinity meant in this particular community. And I had shaped Victor to be a very different young boy. And in speaking about sort of what's expected and what a young boy would be able to know and do at his age, at 12 years old, he would go off for weeks. You know, I mean, the entire first part of my book is shaped from that. And our ideas about masculinity varies from culture to culture. You know, there is no one way to be a man from indigenous cultures to Caribbean culture to Irish culture. Like, at least I hope not, right? I hope we're more nuanced and complex as that. But I mean, frankly, women have a lot to do with the shaping of masculinity, or at least I think we do. And I think that that as we see women become more empowered, we see masculinity getting less structured, less sharp, I think. You know, more allowances for men to be sort of many different ways. I think that clearly comes from women being able to have more of a voice in the shaping of sons and the men in their lives.
No, yeah, it's interesting. I'm sorry, just quickly, but Bell Hooks in The Will to Change writes about how men are never taught to love, and that in order for men to actually get over this sort of the patriarchy, or sort of to break it down, is to have discussions about how to love and how to have feelings. And I think that's like really important, and sort of leads into what you were saying about, you know, I think men have a lot of work to do, you know, in all sorts of ways, but they do need help. At least that's what Belle says, you know. But Belle's always right, so yeah.
5 minutes. Another question?
Well, I couldn't just help. This wasn't actually the question I was going to ask, but just to make a comment that the way that men can learn to love is by reading good books. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to encourage people to just to read good novels. So. But I did also have a question about you sort of just hinted at there about your process of researching this history, which is not a history which is particularly well known. I'm thinking particularly here of the Caribbean, North American linkages, and this, you know, the movements of people within that, and particularly movement of black people within that, you know, Caribbean to North America sort of milieu in the, I'm thinking here, you know, 18th and early 19th century. Right. How did you go about researching that?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the first things I did was I began to look at. I mean, Eric Williams shaped this book so much, to be honest with you. Like, reading his books and realizing how much we didn't know about the people who were in the Caribbean during these times. I mean, you know, in his books, you know, there's census material. There's free coloreds, enslaved blacks, people who were coming, Martinique citizens, former Martinique citizens, French citizens. It's all there, and yet there were all these empty spaces, all these things that we didn't know. In my research, I could see letters from Englishmen who were writing back home. Oh, it's hot here. Oh boy, we're working very hard, and they have a voice in the history. And so for me, I had to really figure out, like, okay, so who are these people in these places? Who are these people on these islands? If they're free, are they land owning? So I began to sort of dig around, like, who are the free colored people of color who are actually land owning citizens, and what does their life look like? Some of that I got answered, and some of them I didn't get answered, right? But there were ships. What I did find was sort of ships leaving from Trinidad, going into Mexico, because there's a revolution happening in Mexico, and people were financially supporting the revolution in Mexico. So there are these ships moving. So I decided, what does it look like if we also decide to go and move? There's ships happening. So Rosa clearly takes that path. She takes this path through Mexico and then into North America. And my research, I sort of put two different strings of research together. In essence, I found this black Crow man. He was a chief in the Crow tribe, and I thought to myself, well, I've never heard of him. Anybody ever hear of him before? And I began to sort of dig around, like, what does his life look like, and what does it look like? We know that Africans and indigenous folks have met. We know that from here in the Caribbean, and we know that in North America. What does it look like if I put these people together? And it's, it was a feat of imagination, but not so in so many ways, because we don't know, because there's no records for us. So does Rosa exist? Does her journey exist? Sure. Yeah, I believe it does, because we move when there are opportunities and when we're running from things. Transient people, I told you that, Teresa. We're transient people. My father used to tell me that all the time. We move when we have to live and survive.
Yeah, I think we're wrapping up. We know that Tituba was Barbadian. We know that the plantation model in the southern states came out of the Barbadian plantation model. Barbados was very British, changed hands only once. But what we don't see is that, or we don't imagine, is the Indigenous American and the African person. Though after reading your book, I was in New York, and it was all there in the art. It was in the quilts. But when you started to look, you could see it. And what we don't know is how some of those people could be Caribbean. And that's why it's really important to have Bocas, who tells these amazing stories about seemingly obscure, but actually very real lives. And getting these books out there where people don't have to have a glossary of their expressions and don't have to change their language to suit a sort of a Northern European reader who's used to standard English. So I think that takes us to the end. And thanks again for a great audience. Thank again.
You so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa.
I managed to keep my composure. Now I can go and howl.